Inside of St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, many kings and queens are buried. One of the most notorious kings ever to rule over England is buried in the choir. Henry VIII is found alongside the tyrant King Charles I, who lost his head following the English Civil War. But most recently, St. George's Chapel was the site of the burial of Queen Elizabeth II, a woman who is remembered most fondly in the memories of most of the world as just the Queen. Elizabeth II was the longest reigning monarch in British history, and she had a number of specific plans outlined for her burial, and even the site of her interment and burial was prepared for her, and she consulted on the plans for this. But most people think that Elizabeth II is buried inside of the royal vault, but this is not the case. She was laid to rest in a small memorial chapel which was built during her reign upon her request. But what is the story of this small vault and chapel? The King George VI Memorial Chapel inside St. George's Chapel in Windsor was commissioned by Elizabeth II to be built in 1962, and it was intended to be the burial place of her father, George VI, and her mother. The work for the chapel was significant, and the architects wanted to design the small chapel to contain the remains of 3 monarchs and also their consorts. Elizabeth II's private secretary had, in December of 1962, written to the Dean of Windsor with 2 requests. Firstly, that Prince Charles, her eldest son, be prepared for confirmation, and secondly, that a specific resting place was to be found for her father, George VI. Following George's funeral, his remains were lowered into the vault, and they had been stored away there due to the fact that George's death was a shock, and there was no pre-made tomb or space for his body to be interred. Elizabeth II wanted for this a specific part of inside of St. George's Chapel to be for her family, and this is what was designed. A small chapel which came out from the side of the part of the chapel. The request initially was not actioned for 5 years, as the Queen wanted her mother to avoid burying her husband a second time. The Queen also did not like life-size effigies on tombs that were found all over places like Westminster Abbey, and also St. George's Chapel for monarchs of the past, and space was very tight already inside of the chapel. Because of this, it was decided that a chantry would be built to the exterior of St. George's Chapel, and that the entrance to this would be off the nave. This was the first addition to the chapel since the early 16th century. There were different plans drawn up for the burial chapel, and many were rejected, but the second plan was proposed by architect George Pace. This involved the creation of the chantry chapel between the Rutland Chapel and the north choir of St. George's Chapel. This design was small, 18 feet high and 10 feet wide and 14 feet deep. The work was completed in 1969, and it's found between 2 external buttresses of the north wall of the choir, and is made from stone quarried in Clipsum in Rutland. There was stained glass made of red and blue for the small chapel, and the roof is decorated with embedded gold leaf. In the chapel is also an altar that has a portrait of King George VI, and the completed chapel, when finished, was said to have been continuing the features of St. George's Chapel. Beneath the chapel's floor is an interment chamber, and the floor can be lifted to bury monarchs inside of different graves. However, at this current time, the chapel, despite its modernity, is becoming very full up. When viewing the small chapel, and I personally did a few weeks after the death of Queen Elizabeth II, what is very shocking is the size of the room. It might sound small based on the measurements that I have given, but it is incredibly tiny. King George VI's remains were transferred to the newly completed chapel on the 24th of March 1969, and it cost in today's money over £500,000 to build, being entirely funded by the royal family. The chapel was dedicated in a ceremony with much of the royal family, including the Queen Mother, George's wife, and many members of the Order of the Garter were in attendance. The chapel contains gates which the words, "I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, give me a light that I may tread safely to the unknown." And these words were, in 1939, as the Second World War gripped Europe, included in King George VI's Christmas message to the nation, which gave many people hope and security. Also interred inside of the chapel are the ashes of George's younger daughter, Princess Margaret, the Countess of Snowdon. She was the sister of Elizabeth II, and she died after a battle with smoking-related illness. Unlike most members of the royal family, Margaret was actually cremated, and following a private service at St George's Chapel in Windsor, her remains were taken to Slough Crematorium, and she was actually cremated there. Margaret found the royal burial ground at Frogmore rather gloomy, in her words. She wanted to be buried alongside her father, and her ashes were temporarily placed inside of the royal vault of St George's Chapel, before they were then moved to King George VI Memorial Chapel, following the funeral of her mother, who died 7 weeks later. The plan was to always bury the Queen Mother inside of this new chapel also, as there was space for her to be buried in the same grave as King George. She died, of course, decades later, and the remains of Margaret were interred at the same time as the coffin of her mother was buried in the small interment chamber beneath the chapel's floor. Margaret's ashes were fetched from the royal vault and were placed inside of her parents' tomb, at the same time meaning that buried under George VI's ledger stone is not just he and his wife, but his daughter, Princess Margaret. There is a tombstone for her that is placed in the right-hand corner of the chapel that reads, "In thankful remembrance of Her Royal Highness the Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, born 21st of August 1930, died 9th of February 2002. There is also on the edge of her tombstone an epitaph written by Margaret herself that states, "We thank thee, Lord, who by thy Spirit doth our faith restore. When we with wordly things commune and prayerless close our door, we lose our precious gift divine to worship and adore. Then thou, our Saviour, fill our hearts to love thee evermore." The next person of the royal family who died and was buried inside of this chapel was Prince Philip, Elizabeth II's husband, who died in 2021. He was a very elderly man by even the standards of modern Britain, and what is not known as well is that following the death of Philip and his funeral, his body was lowered into the royal vault and his coffin was stored there for some time. This was due to potentially some insider knowledge that Elizabeth II was ill or that she did not have long left. Elizabeth II and her husband Philip died roughly a year apart, and Philip's body was left in the royal vault ready to be interred when Elizabeth II died. When Elizabeth's body was taken into St George's Chapel, the service took place and then, of course, her body was lowered into the royal vault. This was the committal, and her body was lowered symbolically into the royal vault. However, after the funeral, in a private service on the 19th of September 2022, at roughly 7:30 p.m, Elizabeth II was laid to rest inside of the memorial chapel that she herself had commissioned. The remains of Prince Philip were also moved into the chapel after the interment of the Queen's too. Interestingly, her coffin was made over 30 years before her funeral and was made of English oak and was lead-lined to attempt to keep off decay. There were 9 pallbearers needed to lower her remains into the vault due to the weight of the wooden coffin. The death of Elizabeth II was something that shocked the world, especially with the fact that many had only ever known one monarch of Britain on the throne. But what is not as well known is that she is not technically buried inside of a royal vault, but in fact in a small memorial chapel that she commissioned to be built herself. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.